They feared Paul Ferris more than the man he worked for. He was the violence behind the empire, until the day he decided the only way out was betrayal. Mix these and give me bust. Paul Ferris wasn't feared because he was a snitch. He was feared long before that. The shocking truth is the man who betrayed Glasgow's Godfather was once the violence that kept the empire alive. Paul Ferris was born in 1960 and raised in Springburn, North Glasgow, an area defined by hard living and harder reputations. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Springburn sat at the edge of a city changing fast. Heavy industry was fading. Unemployment was rising. And on the streets, authority belonged not to police, but to those willing to use force. Violence wasn't an exception here, it was a language. From an early age, Ferris learned how power really worked in North Glasgow. Fear first, respect later. By his early 20s, Paul Ferris was already known to local police, not as a mastermind or organizer, but as a man who showed up when trouble was needed. His earliest convictions were for violent offenses, assaults that carried a message as much as they caused harm. Word spread quickly. Ferris wasn't reckless. He was controlled, direct, and willing to go further than most. That reputation made him valuable. In Glasgow's underworld, value attracts attention. And Ferris caught the eye of Arthur Thompson, Jr., the man the media would later call the Godfather of Glasgow. Thompson didn't need thinkers. He needed certainty, men who wouldn't hesitate. Ferris became one of those men. His role was simple and terrifying: enforce debts, intimidate rivals, and remind entire neighborhoods who truly held power. Ferris didn't run operations. He didn't negotiate. He delivered consequences. Court records and later testimony would describe a pattern of calculated brutality: blades, blunt weapons, and face-to-face threats designed to leave no confusion. In a city already shaped by fear, Ferris became someone even criminals were cautious around. But loyalty in gangland has limits. As Ferris's reputation grew, so did the danger around him. The same violence that made him indispensable also made him expendable, and this was only the beginning. What came next would drag Glasgow's most powerful crime empire toward its collapse and turn its most feared enforcer into its greatest threat. By the late 1980s, Paul Ferris had become a fixed presence in North Glasgow's criminal landscape. He operated across Springburn, Postle Park, and surrounding estates, acting as the physical force behind Arthur Thompson, Jr.'s authority. Ferris didn't control rackets or handle money. His job was simpler and more dangerous. He enforced decisions. When debts went unpaid, when rivals tested boundaries, when fear needed renewing, Ferris was sent. His reputation hardened quickly. Associates described him as methodical, not impulsive. Violence wasn't emotional, it was functional. Police intelligence files began to list his name repeatedly, linking him to intimidation, weapons possession, and serious assaults. Still, charges were difficult to prove. Victims refused to testify. Witnesses vanished. Silence protected the organization. In Glasgow's underworld, Ferris became known as the man who made problems end, and that reputation only deepened his value and the danger around him. In the late 1980s, a rival criminal attempted to operate inside Thompson-controlled territory in North Glasgow. According to later court testimony, the response was swift. Ferris was instructed to deal with it personally. The attack took place in a residential area, in full view of locals who immediately looked away. The victim was confronted and assaulted with a weapon, sustaining serious injuries that required hospital treatment. The purpose wasn't murder. It was demonstration. A warning delivered face to face. The aftermath spread faster than the incident itself. Word traveled through pubs, housing schemes, and rival circles. Thompson's control was not theoretical. It was enforced physically, and Ferris was proof of that. Police were aware of the assault but struggled to build a case. No witnesses came forward. The victim refused cooperation. For Ferris, the attack cemented his standing. For rivals, it erased any doubt. Challenging the Thompson organization meant dealing with Ferris directly, but the violence was far from over. Over the next several years, Ferris was linked to multiple violent incidents. Debt collections that ended in broken bones. Threats delivered with blades openly displayed. Intimidation carried out in daylight. Each incident followed the same pattern: swift, personal, and brutal. Police believe Ferris was involved in many more attacks than could ever be proven. Fear kept victims silent. Entire estates understood the message without it needing repetition. By the early 1990s, Ferris wasn't just feared by civilians. He was feared by criminals, and that's when the danger turned inward. By 1991, the atmosphere inside the Thompson organization began to change. Success bred suspicion. Loyalty was questioned. Rumors of informants circulated constantly. According to later testimony, Ferris became increasingly convinced that his own position had shifted from asset to liability. In gangland culture, experienced enforcers know too much, and men who know too much don't live long. Ferris began altering routines. He armed himself constantly. He trusted fewer people. Associates noticed the shift. Conversations became shorter, meetings more guarded. Ferris believed that if the organization ever needed a scapegoat or an example, he would be first. The fear wasn't paranoia without cause. Glasgow's criminal history was filled with trusted lieutenants who disappeared when they became inconvenient. Ferris understood the rules better than most. He had enforced them. For the first time, Ferris wasn't thinking about how to hurt others. He was thinking about survival. And that realization led him to a decision that would change everything. In 1992, Paul Ferris crossed a line that almost no one in Glasgow's underworld had ever crossed. He talked. Ferris approached police and agreed to cooperate with prosecutors, offering insider testimony against Arthur Thompson Jr. and the organization Ferris himself had enforced. The decision wasn't framed as remorse. It was calculation. Ferris believed the system he had protected was preparing to destroy him. What he provided was devastating. Ferris detailed how the Thompson empire operated, how decisions were passed down, how intimidation and violence were organized, how territory was controlled through fear rather than paperwork. For the first time, investigators had confirmation of patterns they had suspected for years. Police moved quickly. Surveillance evidence was re-examined. Financial records were cross-checked. Witness statements were secured with greater confidence. The myth surrounding Thompson's untouchability began to fracture. Inside the underworld, panic followed. Ferris's cooperation sent shockwaves through Glasgow's criminal networks. If an enforcer of his level could talk, no one was safe. Trust collapsed overnight. Associates turned on each other. Silence, once absolute, began to crack. For Ferris there was no return. Cooperation meant permanent exile from the life he knew. It also meant survival, at least for now. For Thompson, the consequences were immediate. Arrest followed. Charges were brought. The empire that had ruled through fear was suddenly exposed to daylight, and in Glasgow, one truth became unavoidable. The most dangerous man in the organization wasn't the Godfather, it was the man who decided to speak. The police investigation accelerated rapidly after Paul. Ferris agreed to cooperate. Detectives revisited years of intelligence, now armed with insider confirmation. Surveillance logs were cross-checked against Ferris's statements. Financial records were examined to trace protection payments and criminal proceeds. Patterns that once looked circumstantial began to align. What had been suspicion hardened into evidence. For the first time, prosecutors could place structure around Glasgow's most feared criminal organization and show how violence, intimidation, and control were systematically enforced. Ferris's testimony became the keystone, dangerous, controversial, but impossible to ignore. Arrests followed. Senior figures linked to the Thompson organization were detained and questioned. The focus, however, remained firmly on Arthur Thompson, Jr. He was charged and brought before the High Court of Justiciary in Glasgow, marking one of the most significant organized crime prosecutions Scotland had seen. The courtroom atmosphere was tense. Security was tight. The stakes were enormous. Prosecutors laid out the case piece by piece, detailing rackets, intimidation campaigns, and the chain of command that led back to Thompson. The defense attacked Ferris's credibility, portraying him as a violent criminal seeking to save himself. But corroborating evidence undermined that argument. This time, silence could not protect the accused. The verdict brought an era to an abrupt end. Thompson was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. The sentence carried enormous symbolic weight. Glasgow's so-called Godfather, long believed untouchable, had fallen. For communities that had lived under fear for years, the conviction marked a rare moment of accountability. For the underworld, it was a warning that even the most powerful figures could be dismantled from within. The aftermath was quieter, but no less significant. Thompson would die in 1993, less than a year after his conviction, closing the chapter on one of Scotland's most notorious crime bosses. Paul Ferris served time for his own offenses and later lived under constant threat, his betrayal ensuring permanent exile from the world he once enforced. The empire collapsed, but the cost was heavy on all sides. In the end, justice didn't arrive through gunfire or revenge. It arrived through testimony spoken by the very man who once made the violence possible. Paul Ferris wanted power, respect, and survival inside Glasgow's underworld. What he became was something far more dangerous, a man who proved that even the most feared empires can collapse from within. His betrayal rewrote the rules of silence and shattered a criminal dynasty. In the end, Glasgow learned a cold truth. Violence builds empires, but words can destroy them. The events described in this video are based on publicly available information, court records, and news reports. All individuals mentioned are considered innocent unless proven guilty in a court of law. This content is presented for informational and documentary purposes only.